This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. Today's episode explores the uniqueness and power of communal prayer, alongside some of its challenges for women and men alike. We also discuss the limitations that can impact women's participation in this context.
Hi, Yosefa.
Hi, Shana.
So today's discussion is around communal prayer. And before we get into the details of it, I just want to put something on the table, which is that I feel a very personal connection to this topic. And I am aware that that is not necessarily the most typical. I grew up the daughter of a rabbi, as you know, and because of that, our shul was like literally a second home for me and I think for my entire family. And I'm very aware, therefore, that the passion that I feel about davening as part of a community and specifically as part of a shul and specifically in a minyan is very connected to the way that I was raised and to those early childhood experiences that are so forming, in terms of identity. And I know that that's not necessarily the typical experience, especially for women. And still, I wanted to bring that in to share that because it gives insight, I think, into where sometimes that sense of community or that sense of belonging or even that sense of connecting to others and standing before God, like how we could tap into it and how we can maybe help ourselves to feel that. When I was a little girl, the way that our shul was constructed, largely because of space constraints, was that the balcony was where most of the women sat. There was a small women's section down below, but most of the women were up above. And even though there's definitely challenging parts of that experience for women because it emphasizes that feeling of like being somewhat removed or being more of an observer and a spectator to whatever's going on below, at the same time, being in a physical place where I could like observe most of the congregation and I could see them when they were davening was something that I actually found to be very inspiring. And I think is part of that communal experience of davening. It also definitely, for me, was further strengthened by the fact that I knew that my parents were very well connected and were very deeply aware of the different members of the community and the issues that were going on in their lives. So whether they knew that a couple was struggling with, shalom bayit and marriage issues, or with parnasa and livelihood challenges, or with just the day-to-day grind of raising kids, or with a sick family member, I knew that they had them in mind in their tefillot, and that naturally helped give me perspective that part of what is meaningful about davening with a community and being part of a communal experience of prayer is that tefillah is not only about our own personal needs. Like until now in earlier episodes, we've discussed what it means to stand before God and to have that counter and to know that you're talking to Hashem. But I think a big part of tefillah that's certainly emphasized in the Gemara when it talks about how God really thinks there's special value with groups that come before him and that he doesn't reject the prayers of many, is that when we daven together with others, we're kind of coming out of ourselves a little bit and thinking beyond just what are my personal needs and what are my personal aspirations and what do I want for myself, but connecting ourselves to something greater, than just who we are, to the members of the community. And I really felt this power as a little girl, and it, thank God, it's continued to stay with me.
I really appreciate that we're starting off this conversation from that personal space. And while I didn't grow up as the child of the rabbi and the rebbitzin of the community, I think I mentioned on our Rosh Hashanah episode that in my early years, we were also part of like a very small, very close-knit community, and that left a very, very big imprint on me in many, many ways. And one of them, I think, was the sense that like the ideal form of a group of observant people is in a community. My father was the chazan. My mother was the head of all different kinds of committees and things like that. And it was also, we lived down the street from the shul, and that was a very, very formative part of my experience and a lot of where my family's energies were invested. So I definitely felt something similar to that. I think also being a student and teacher of Tanakh this is what we do, is we get together and we pray. I think of Shmuel at the Mitzvot and all different other biblical examples. Like this is the cases of personal tefillot are much fewer, and the cases of gathering or making sure that people gather in order to ask for something that the community needs is something that, I don't know, I guess I teach all the time, so it definitely goes somewhere as well. And I think just to sort of tag on to that last piece that you said, that what I think is, to me, most helpful and powerful about davening with a group of people is that it takes us out of our personal space, meaning I appreciate sort of being lifted out. Sometimes I can almost forget, honestly, the personal space. I'm often less good at that part, but meaning that you're with other people and then you remember, oh, I'm saying the same tefillah many times a day because these are apparently the values of our community, right? Of Yerushalayim and v'techazene enenu and healing for the sick and all of these the prayers that we say constantly. It's sort of, I feel like it creates a certain proportionality. Also, just being with other people and remembering that it's not me in my home alone, me and God. It is sometimes, and that's great, but that there's something I think helpful because especially, let's say, when someone's experiencing something that's challenging, I like the feeling of being sort of plopped into the community and remembering that whatever I'm going through is a small piece in something much, much greater. I find that it's helpful for me. Like it gives me perspective. Yeah, it gives me perspective on whatever I'm experiencing. And just in general, we know that the power of many, has so many advantages over one person. And I think that that's something, those are just some like sort of initial pieces that come up for me when I think in general about collective prayer.
Absolutely. I think it's noteworthy that halachically, when we talk about communal prayer, we are usually specifically referring to two specific elements of tefillah that Rav Soloveitchik liked to highlight as each having a dependent value. So one of them is what we refer to as tefillah b'tzibor, meaning prayer in the community. And that refers to each of us as individuals reciting the Amidah, reciting the Shemona Esrei to ourselves silently, but at the same time. So when you come to shul and you get up to that part where everybody starts davening that silent tefillah, but everybody's davening it together. So even though it's something that you could say on your own in the privacy of your home, there's a power in each person saying it on their own, but at the same time. And that's what we call tefillah b'tzibor. And many halachic authorities actually view this simultaneous recitation as the really core central element as communal prayer, which is surprising, because sometimes we think, oh, the value of coming to shul and davening in a minyan is the dvarim that we say, dvarim sheb kedusha, the things that you could only say with the minyan, like kaddish or kedusha or baruch hu. But actually, perhaps even more meaningful than that is just turning to God as a group. Davening your own tefillah, but as part of a bigger group is considered very valuable. And secondly, the other aspect of communal prayer is that in the tefillot of Shacharit and Mincha and Musaf on Shabbat and Chagim and Rosh Chodesh, there's a repetition of the Amidah, the Chazarat Hashatz, that the Shaliach Tzibor, the leader of the prayers, recites out loud, which is that after the community finishes saying each person their silent recitation of the Amidah, so then the Shaliach Tzibor repeats the entire Shemona Esrei out loud, and that's called Tfilat HaSibor, the prayer of the community. And some major authorities, like the Rambam, think that this repetition, which is like the whole community coming together and bringing this tefillah together, is also the, very, very central to what it means to daven as a community. And I was thinking about the fact that for many women, and probably even for many men, this aspect of realizing how much value there is to just praying along with a group is not always at the forefront of people's minds. A lot of women, I think, view coming to shul, as kind of like, or maybe men also, that there's like a ritual that's going on, and it's almost like a performance, especially if you're in the women's section. So you're kind of watching some ritualistic performance that's being led by the Shaliach Tzibor, and that like you're here could kind of like participate as an observer. But what Rav Soloveitchik is emphasizing is that the real action in shul is not like what the prayer leader is doing, or it's not the various kibudim, the various honors that individuals get. The real action is the event of all of us coming together to pray. So I know we're gonna, get into more talk about minyan and what it feels like to not count as part of that quorum of 10 and the impression that that can make of us as women. But separate and apart from that, it's just important for me to note that women are considered full participants, full and equal participants when it comes to tefillah b'tzibor, this davening along with the congregation. And Rav Soloveitchik writes out in a very direct way in his Shiurim on Masechet Sukkah, he says that while the halacha of women in these matters is that they're not able to establish the minyan, which makes communal tefillah obligatory and fitting, or to be the shaliach tzibor, who discharges the obligation of the masses in tefillah, even so, when there is a minyan of men, a woman also joins them as part of the entity of the tzibor that prays, meaning that once there's a minyan, anyone in addition to that, like a woman is just the same as an 11th man or 12th man, meaning once there's a minyan present, there's this equalizing force that then, kind of comes into play. And that is something that I think we should be aware of. And it's part of the reason that some of our earliest sources, way, way, way before Rav Soloveitchik in the 20th century, already talk about how meritorious it is for a woman to make an effort to come to Communal tefillah. So whether it's the Midrash Yalkut Shimoni, who talks about a very old woman who was scrupulous about going to daven in a shul, and they believe that that's why she merited this prolonged life, or Rav Eliyahu Kalisher, who's a student of Rav Chaim Volozhin, who goes so far as to say that in the discussion about whether in order to daven a silent tefillah b'tzibor, you need 10 men who were not yet, who have not yet prayed to be present. And he says it doesn't need to be 10 men. It could even be women, who are part of that tzibor who have not yet prayed in order to effectuate this idea of a tzibor davening together. So I think that aspect is something that I come back to, that even with all the complications of the things we're going to discuss, just being part of a tzibor is considered something very valuable for women as well.
I think also another important halachic iteration of this idea of the importance of us being with the tzibur and trying to align our tefillah with the tzibur. So it's really brought some modern poskim like Rav Baruch Gigi, who's the Rosh Yeshiva Yeshivat Har Tzion of the Gush, as is often called. And he holds that if a woman comes late to shul, that she should abbreviate her tefillot in order to try and catch up in time to say the Shemona Esrei. By the way, I didn't grow up knowing Rav Baruch Gigi, but this is what I was taught.
Yeah,
I didn't.
It's not only him.
Yeah, I know. I'm saying I know. I think that this obviously is many because that's what I was taught from a pretty young age.
Meaning, if you come late to shul, you got to.
But you're still there in Shachar. You got to cut it so that you can make it for Shemona Esrei, because that's the ikar of the tefillah.
Say those main things we discussed last week,
exactly.
Like Baruch Shamar, Ashish Tabach, whatever Shema, and then get there in time to daven your Amidah together. Yeah, and if you get there too late in order to catch up for Shacharit, then it's very possible that it would be best to say your silent Shacharit Amidah at the time that the Tzibur is saying Musaf, meaning to time the Shemona Esrei in that. Additionally, she should listen to Kriyat Torah, unless it means that by doing so, she might totally miss the time for Shemona Esrei of Shacharit, but ideally also should be with the Tzibur when they're reading the Torah. Not everyone holds like this. There are definitely poskim who think that women coming late to the Beit Knesset shouldn't adjust their tefillot to catch up, but I think the fact that even that there is a pretty long-standing idea that she should do that just reinforces halachically the idea that you're expressing, which is that the ikar, right, the main point of being in shul is to daven with everyone together. Yeah. And so we try and enable that to happen. Yeah, but you definitely see women doing different things. Like I come sometimes and I'm like rushing or whatever, and then like the whole tzibur is having Shemona Esrei, and you see a woman who's like sitting benacha while everyone else is standing, and she's catching up. And there really are different opinions about this. But it is important to know that that option of davening with the tzibur is something that may be worth making an effort towards.
Okay, but I also wanted to be real, Shayna. And I think that not everyone, certainly on the female side, is making it to shul. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important, before we get into the other complex questions we want to raise, to think about why is it that a lot of times women are not making their way there, or not there for much of the tefillah.
Mm-hmm. Even women, by the way, who are very serious in their halachic observance and who are, insiders in terms of avodat Hashem. Yeah, then you see that they're absent from shul.
Totally. And I think that there are probably a few basic reasons why this might be the case. One is that it might not be what was traditionally done in their lives and the lives of the previous generations and their family. Women in many communities do not traditionally attend shul and aren't even encouraged to do so. And sometimes it's because they're emphasizing other forms of avodat Hashem that should take precedence, whether it's chesed or child rearing. And it could be that receives more like social support or reinforcement from the community or its leaders. And they might be given the impression that there really is no additional benefit to them being in the tzibur, which is obviously different than what we've presented until now. But that definitely is a strain of an idea that's expressed in many communities.
Women who like go to shurim or are involved in chesed or really are active members of their community in different ways, but then in their shuls, like their women's section even barely exists sometimes. There's like a row or two because it's just so not the norm.
Right. And I think that even in a community where there is a women's section, a lot of times there are women who are hesitant because they're not sure, is it going to be occupied by a man sometimes, or that's uncomfortable, or maybe it's really small and uninviting, or there's different questions regarding the way the shul is structured in that way that makes them sort of feel that they don't have a place there. And I think that it's also important to note that regular shul attendance, whether it's Shabbat and certainly during the week, is often not as common among women who are raising young children. Right. And so you have sort of like, factor. You have, a particular stage of life before that, whatever that means, however long that is, that it might be more common for women to go then. And then when there isn't that sense of I need to be at home or my house structure can't accommodate this right now. So then you have a different group of women more who are post that stage who might also be more of the mainstay in shul. And it's definitely, I'll also just add one other piece that there are shuls that are also more accommodating towards little children and shuls that are less accommodating. And that's also a really, really big factor of where does a woman feel comfortable or a man coming and bringing their children, how much can
or even coming with a baby.
Yeah, coming with a baby, how much is that appreciated in the shul? How much is, I'll even say something really silly. Like I remember visiting in the States a whole bunch of times, and you're actually not allowed to bring a stroller into the shul building. Now it's for security purposes from their perspective, but I said that's an amazing way to enable me not to come here for years at a time. Meaning in other times, again, I don't right now have a stroller, but that was the only way I could, because then the kid could sleep and I could be there. Do you know what I'm saying? Right. But it's an amazing a very effective way to keep people of a certain stage of life out of that place, which obviously wasn't their intention, but it is an outcome. So I think that that's also an important piece. Another piece that we often can hear is this question about kavanah, of where women feel that they can best focus, or where they feel like they are most present in their tefillah. And many women, and I would say men, many women or men might say that their private tefillah is much more conducive for them. And women who are free of the obligation of tefillah b'tzibur, they might choose that kind of private prayer over the public experience. And as you said before, some women just experience shul as kind of a passive entity, and it's not necessarily something that feels that it pulls them in. And so I think that this is a really important piece. Also in the Gemara, it tells us that Rabbi Akiva sometimes prayed with the tzibur, and sometimes he was alone. And when he was alone, his tefillah had a special quality. And I think also that certainly if someone doesn't grow up, and here I'm thinking about women more than men, if someone doesn't grow up getting used to the pace of the communal prayer, which can be, let's say on a weekday, really, really quick. And if they're not used to that, then it can feel jarring, and they don't necessarily want to get used to it, right? If someone hears this episode and they're like, okay, great, so I really want to go, and I want to go to shul now, and then they show up and they're like, this is really, really fast, and I can't even hear what they're saying. So that obviously could also be a barrier sometimes. And I think that, again, women, because we don't have this obligation, can kind of make their call in terms of how much they engage in this sense of the communal prayer. Again, I believe we know that there is a certain advantage to that being with a tzibur, as we said before, but we have a choice. And there's also something nice about being able to have that choice and to be able to dip into it when we want. Of course, that's different on special occasions like Shabbat Zachor, or moments where we're supposed to hear a particular Kriyat Torah. But obviously, there's something that is nice about the ability to jump into that when we want to. But there could be challenges just on the way that communal prayer functions, right? We'll talk about other challenges in a moment.
Yeah. By the way, it's by no means clear that men are obligated in communal prayer, which is surprising for people to hear. There are poskim like the Maharil who present public prayer as a type of hidur mitzvah, what we know is considered a glorification of the mitzvah tefillah, but not an outright obligation. And these poskim hold that while a community has a collective obligation to ensure that there is a minyan going on in town so that tefillah hatzibor can take place, in every community around the world where there are Jews, and that an individual should certainly make an effort to attend the minyan if there's one that's in reasonable distance. At the same time, though, once there is a minyan happening, it could be that each individual is not obligated to attend, which is really, really interesting. There's other poskim like the Torah who suggest that no, individuals do have an obligation to attend communal prayer, but even those poskim are typically not referring to women in this case. And we see just from centuries of practice, as you just mentioned, kind of what traditionally was done, many women did not go to shul. There's even many shuls that we know did not have women's sections at all, or had very small ones that certainly couldn't accommodate everybody. So on the one hand, normative halacha, as we experience it today, has developed in a way that does push for men to prioritize communal prayer over praying with more kavanah. But the calculus, as you mentioned earlier, for women may be different. And women may decide that she, wants to choose to daven on her own at a slower pace or in a way where she could more focus. At the same time, a woman who does make the effort to participate in tefillah b'tzibor is really availing herself of an opportunity that we believe has great spiritual and even halachic value.
Yeah, I think that piece about the fact that in the frum community today, right, a mark of the frum guy is that they're going to shul and they're making that effort. I would say also especially for shacharit, or right, there are these markers, these communal markers, and I think that they're important. Again, we've spoken about that. There's halacha and then there's communal expectations, and they're probably of equal importance in many ways.
A guy who davens b'tzibur 3 times a day and goes to minyan is definitely considered a mark of a serious, ben Torah.
Yeah, but I also want to throw out the idea, Shayna, that I think the calculus for men is also realistically gets adjusted at different moments of life, and also sometimes maybe needs to be encouraged to adjust that. What do I mean by that? Meaning people have complications, right? They had to go somewhere for work. And certainly if you're outside of Israel, there isn't a minyan necessarily everywhere. And that's a reality. So you have to daven b'yechidut. Or maybe there was, but it's really, really complicated to get there. And so a person has to make a decision. A man has to make a decision, how much effort am I making? Am I just going to let it be, right? I'm going to daven and it's okay, but I'm going to possibly leave that hidur, that sort of extra piece of the communal prayer on the side.
I mean, to what extent do I rearrange my entire day around the minyan?
Yeah, and it could be very, very limiting sometimes. And I just think that if you also throw it into, and then there's a family there, sometimes it could be a major imposition on the family. I don't mean to accommodate, but it can also be an imposition. And I think that it's also worth saying that there are stages of life, certainly when there are, a lot of smaller children, that, the joke of the house is a whole balagan, time for mincha, and I'm just I
think that's a joke in many homes.
No, it's maybe not, meaning maybe we need to go to a later minyan, or maybe if it's something so difficult, then maybe that needs to be assessed whether or not that's the right thing to do right now. And
You're saying it shouldn't be a trump card.
No, it should not be a trump card. I think that also it could be an unkind trump card sometimes. And I think that many women want to accommodate and they want to respect it, but I think that they're also ultimately, I just think there needs to be a conversation between spouses where they're both feeling seen, and to figure out what might work for them, and to know that different stages of life require something different. And I'm even just going to say something personal here. Again, married to my husband Zevi, very, very committed to shul, but had many years to practice now of having to figure out how to accommodate life and the complexities of life. But I wanted to say that, we've already come back to a different stage where sometimes when he'll know that I really would prefer him to be home, and he says to me, but I really don't want to get to a place where not going is not something that I feel distressed about. I want to feel that this is hard for me. And
he doesn't want it to be the norm that he easily just says, oh, too hard to go to minyan.
Exactly. He doesn't want it to be that way.
That's where the conversation comes in.
And so there's that conversation that happens. And again, I am not saying it has to be every day. It doesn't have to be something exhausting, but I think that it's worth having the conversation, because we really don't want to get to a point where fulfilling something that isn't clear that it's an obligation then creates strife in a relationship. And this is an issue, Shayna, and resentment. Yeah. This is an issue that can create that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm just thinking about all different scenarios and also
many
different
years.
households. We were an all-girls house, but like because my father was the rabbi and like minyan, it was also part of his job. He had to be there. Yeah. Like our family functioned around minyan, and when we vacationed, it was like, where's the minyan? And the thought of like that you sometimes like maybe could daven b'yichudut, it was just so not an option. And yeah, it comes up in my home today because we just recently we were away, and it was like, okay, how do we balance and prioritize? And are there times where maybe it's not the right thing to go to Crazy Lens, to go to Minyan, which is like, but yeah, I think it's an important conversation. As you mentioned, it really can be a perk to not be obligated in communal prayer for exactly all the reasons you described, whether it's the time flexibility or whether it's the opportunities to really have a more focused, concentrated tefillah. As the mother of boys, sometimes they're like, Ima, like, I don't remember the last time I said a full psuke de Zimra. Like, if you come a minute late to shul, they're already at like Shema,
We
it's like,
that in the last episode.
Yeah, there's, as you said, also it's so fast.
Yeah.
It's so fast, especially on a weekday morning where people have to get out to work. So just being able to daven at your own pace and not be racing through is something that sometimes, is something that, as you said, we could kind of lean into. And I also remember speaking to a young woman on a college campus who really, really, really valued Tefillah B'tzibur, and she loved going to Minyan, and she so appreciated the fact that on her secular campus, the fact that there was like this religious structure to her day, because she tried to go 3 times a day to Minyan, and like her day started with Shacharit and Mincha and Mariv. It really anchored her in her religious life, and I think for many people, for many men especially, Minyan is that. Like, it gives structure and it gives routine and it just gives a framework. But she said they davened so quickly, and she really felt like she was davening 3 times a day, but she didn't feel like she was concentrating much. And after talking it through, she decided that while she was going to continue to go to Minyan for Mincha and Mariv, when it came to Shachrit, she was going to go on Mondays and Thursdays when they leaned. But on the other day, she said, it's not that I'm going to sleep in. I'm going to still wake up at the same time, but I'm going to daven on my own in a way that, is matim for me, or where I could really focus on the tefillot that I want to be saying, and on just even like a more real or deeper, experience that she wanted to have. And I thought that was significant. In my own life, I personally try to be very makpid to go to shul and also to get there on time on Shabbos morning and on Chagim, especially now that my kids are older and I don't have the, excuse that I'm home with them. But even when I had younger kids, this was a priority for me. So my husband, who was also on board and facilitating that, he would go to an earlier minyan on Shabbat morning so that I could get to the regular minyan as close to on time as possible.
Just want to say, by the way, where I live, many women go to the early minyan, and then my husband goes to the regular.
Could do it the other way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like the point is that there is an early minyan, that you could go to, that someone could go to. But when I was younger, in high school and in college, and I was living in America, so Sundays was a day off, I made a real effort to go to shul on Sunday mornings, and that was a very special experience for me. Obviously didn't continue like throughout that chunk of time that I had little kids, but there was a stage a few years ago where it's just, I realized, hey, I'm dropping off my last kinet gan right across the street from all the ganim, the kindergartens, and Alon Shved is the shul, and like I dropped her off just as the 7:45 minyan was starting, and there was like a year or two where it just worked perfectly in my morning schedule that I went, and I really, really, really appreciated starting off my morning like that. Recently, it's been more difficult. There's exercises, there's a lot of competing things, and my daughter leaves later and different things like that, but I will say that this morning, because after 2 weeks of prepping for this episode, it's been on my mind. I'm like, I am going to go. So this morning, I didn't go to exercise. I went to shul to the 8 o'clock minyan.
Wow,
I was really proud of myself. But I didn't do it I did it because I really just wanted emotionally to kind of tap back into that experience before coming here, of what it's like to daven in the weekday minyan. And yes, it was speedy. We started at 8, and at 8:15 we were already in like the silent Shona Esrei. And at the same time, it was great. I personally, as I said, just really love that experience of being in shul with other people. I know, though, that even with that, one of the main challenges for myself included, and for many women, that prevents them from going to minyan more, is that feeling that we don't count at shul, since we're not counted in a minyan of 10. And just to go into this a little bit, we're not going to have the full conversation, but the idea of the number 10 being a significant number is found in the Gemara in Brachot, which tells us that God is present and really found in the synagogue, and specifically in the presence of 10. And there are 2 examples in the Torah itself that offer precedent for 10 constituting a minimal quorum for a community and for inviting the Shekhinah, the divine presence. One, I think, is the example of where Avram in Parshat Vayera is davening for God not to destroy Sodom, and he says, if there's 50 righteous people, if there's 40, and his final bargaining position is the presence of 10 righteous men. So we see a precedent there. And the second is that the assignment of judges, of Shoftim for Bnei Yisrael, indicates that the lowest level officials were appointed for groups of 10. Now, what is interesting and less well known is that the Torah does not detail who counts towards these groups of 10 that represent the community, meaning the proof text for the Talmudic statement uses the term Edah. And the term Edah, we know from elsewhere in Tanakh, is associated with a group of free adult men. And that's how the Gemara draws the conclusion that specifically free adult men are who are required for a minyan. But it's a complicated topic, and it's not the most clear. So because it's very complex, we're not going to discuss all the details now of defining a minyan and how they get to the conclusions that they get to. But I highly, highly recommend reading the articles on the Deracheha website. They are phenomenally well-researched and thoroughly written. They're linked here, in the show notes below. And they were put together by the Deracheha founder, who is Rabbanit Lori Novik, and I think she did an excellent job of exploring all aspects of this question. What matters, though, now for this conversation is that halachic authorities through the ages had been quite certain that women cannot count towards this minyan, even though, again, how they get there is more complicated, and even though there's different reasons given for why this should be the case. Now, these explanations that are given, they tend to center on very technical halachic reasoning, what we call pilpul, like these back and forth, very nuanced, whatever, halachic discussions, and not on theological or sociological statements about women and their capabilities. And still, despite that, and despite the fact that, as we've said a few times, women are considered part of a tzibur and are not just spectators, but they're real participants, still, it could be hard and even painful for many women to feel that they don't count in that 10 that are needed to recite Dvarim Shebekdusha.
I just have to tell a funny story before I want to elaborate a little bit on this piece, which is that I play basketball on Motzei Shabbat, and you need 10 people for a basketball game, okay? And the actual group we play in, it caps it at 12, because then one person can swap out every few minutes. And so there were 9 women who had written in that they're in for the game. And then one of the participants in the group, she wrote in, she goes, I'm 10. And then she writes, that's the closest I'm ever get to counting for a minyan. And I'm also sharing it because, shout out to her, because she listens to these episodes. But it was also really poignant for me what she said there, because it was very much, right, a woman who is of full mind in the modern world. And in the joking way she said it, carries with her, like many women, tongue in cheek, carries with her the feeling that there's this kind of important thing in the way that it's been developed in our communal practice that I don't count for.
Yeah.
And
I remember you actually shared that story, I think, soon after it happened. I don't remember what episode we were talking about it. And like, it made an impact on me because it's like a joke, but it's not a joke.
No, yeah.
It's one of those where everyone reading it is like, yeah, we get you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I also just want to emphasize that while 10 men are needed for a minyan and Rim Shebekdusha, I mean, it does not mean that the Shekhinah only appears for a group of 10 men. I mean, I feel funny speaking for the Shekhinah, by the way. But I'll speak.
You're not the Asian.
I'll speak. Shekhinah is in the feminine.
Such an important point. Yeah. Such an important point.
It goes back to that piece about maybe halachic differences, but we're all equal in the eyes of God. I think that it's the same idea here.
Because people really could get confused and think that the Shekhinah only comes when there's 10 men.
Yeah, like it has importance in whatever way, and that this isn't the only way that we can, invoke the presence of God in the world or make it more present. And I think that I would love to just say here that when 10 women will get together, or 50 women get together, or 5 women get together, that I think that that's also, a very big Kiddush Hashem, and that's also
meaning women who get together to daven or to learn or to do anything that is connected to Kedusha will bring the Shekhinah. Yeah, it's not only something that happens in a minyan. Yeah, I think, therefore, that a big part of our experience in terms of communal prayer could be affected by the way in which we as women think about this topic. I'm not going to put all the onus on us. It's not like only our responsibility, but I think it is somewhat on us to decide, what attitude we want to bring, how much we want to value this, how much we want to invest in it, whether as part of, a minyan experience or in our own groups. But the other big part that's maybe just as important, or maybe I'll dare to say even more important, goes beyond our own thinking as women on this question to how our communities, and especially the men of our communities, because honestly, they are often the ones that set the tone of the Beit Knesset, of the shul, how they create an environment that reflects this awareness that women's presence in a group is valuable. Meaning, how can the communities that we live in help foster the feeling that women are part of the tzibor, and that their presence matters, and that we want them to be part of the shul experience. And sometimes something that happens that could leave a bad taste is that even when there's a welcoming women's section and the lights are on and the air conditioning is on and the door is unlocked and all this, and there's no men there or whatever, sometimes a woman could come to shul and men are late and the group is then waiting for a minyan. And at those moments, especially if there's 9 and people start saying things like, oh, we just need one more person to get started. And it's like, okay, here I am, a full-fledged person, human being. And it's like I'm invisible or insignificant because I don't count towards the very specific need for 10 men to create a minyan. And at those moments, a woman is starkly confronted, with that feeling of like, I don't count. And that's something that I think as a community, we could just be aware of and make an effort to make sure that those experiences are not things that happen frequently.
First of all, that story that you just shared about there were 9 men and one woman. So a student just told me the story that she was in shul on this past Shabbat at Mincha, and that happened. And then they they didn't daven. Right?
Wow.
Yeah. And that's really rough. Like those are moments I pray.
You don't even get a minyan.
Yeah, you don't even get a minyan. Those are moments I pray won't happen. And I just want to share on the positive side. 9 years ago, almost the day of us recording, my father passed away, and for that whole year I said Kaddish twice a day. Doesn't matter the details, but that was my assigned responsibility within our family, and was not a simple experience. A conversation for another time. But one piece that I just want to say that was moving, because there's a lot of fears in the Kaddish piece of being on pace with the minyan, and are you going to go to somewhere new and then they don't have open feelings about it, and that's a Kaddish question. But I remember a specific chazan that I used to go to Marav was very close to my house, and he was also an Avelut. And I remember that he would, and I was pretty much the only woman who would show up to this 9 o'clock minyan in the street. And I remember that he would always look to make sure that I finished my Shmona Esrei so that I would be present for that Kaddish. And it was, here I am, like almost a decade later. And I don't know the guy from Hole in the Wall, but it was so meaningful for me because
Those
it was
little
just
things.
a tiny thing that showed that he knew. And he also knows in that particular
First of
example
all,
of
that he
Kaddish,
saw
it's
you.
really sensitive, that he saw me. And it's a sensitive topic. There's something very uncomfortable about it. Could be uncomfortable a lot of times. And it was such a small gesture and it made a really, really big difference. And I think that in general, these kind of efforts are really important. Now, there are communities that can have tried to make an effort, let's say, of trying to wait to have 10 men and 10 women, even let's say just when they get to Ishtabach, right? So you could say Baruch Hu. So maybe when they get to that piece that there's 10 women and 10 men, this can be very difficult for a community, and therefore practically, I don't think this is caught on in many communities, simply not on the daily minyan basis. I know some that do that on a Shabbat.
Meaning difficult to actually get to 10 women.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to. It's a high expectation, and for a whole host of reasons, maybe it's not
One
simple
of
to
those
achieve
things
that.
that's really nice in theory if we could do that as a community, but we're just not there yet 100%.
Yeah, but I think that there are a whole host of other ways that we can make this better.
I mean, the first very basic constructive step, that could really apply to a huge number of communities is just, as we said, to really put a lot of emphasis and a lot of investment in really ensuring that men come on time to minyan, so that we're never in that situation where we have to actively count and actively wait. And sensitivity in this area already just goes a long, long way to improving the atmosphere for women. So I know in Migdaluz, where there are, hundreds of women sometimes davening together with the minyan, especially, let's say, in the context of slichot, they really try to be on top of this so that we don't have a situation where everyone's waiting. It's oh, what are we waiting for? And we're waiting for that one man to show up. But as you said, there's a lot of different things that could be done.
Well, we already mentioned the idea of early minyan, which of course has to be fitting for the family and whoever is better at waking up. But early minyan and a community having an early minyan. I've never lived somewhere where there wasn't one, but I know there are communities where this is a complex topic because there isn't necessarily an early minyan.
Or because it's not such a big community.
Yeah, not such a big community. Exactly. So, but maybe trying to figure that out is one also way that we can make sure that everyone can try and find their way to get to shul if they would like to. And of course, ensuring that the women's section is accessible with this for disabilities, near a bathroom, that it's lit, right? It's set up. It has sidurim there, that there's heating and air conditioning, right? That's available for them as well.
And it's not locked.
It's not locked, exactly. And also keeping the women's section a women's only space. Again, if I go back to my Kaddish experience, which I will be honest, was my experience of being in shul very, very often throughout the week, right? It was much more in that year. And also in Shacharit, that was frustrating. And I was just walked in with confidence and waited for them to leave the women's section, but that was a thing.
Not every woman is comfortable doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Why are there those men that just love davening in the women's section?
I think a little bit, by the way, it's a total a very simple psychological analysis. I may be wrong, but I think also it's first of all, if they come late, then they don't have to walk in late. But also, I think it's their way of kind of davening alone. I think a lot of men go even though they really want to be alone, and so it's their way of being alone,
having some space.
Yeah, having some space from everybody else, and also, let's be honest, very often it's empty. And so it's hard to keep it open for the one day a week or for the one girl. But what we're trying to say is leave it open because maybe there will be more people who will come also.
But then when a woman walks in and there are men there, and it's you literally feel like you're encroaching on his space because now he has to gather all his things and his tefillin and whatever. And
they don't
you're
look at you
wait,
'cause they're wearing
is this
tefillin.
your space? Is this my space? It's it's a complicated experience.
Yeah, and also sometimes there could be sort of conversations that happen by the mechitza, and that could be disturbing for women, not realizing that a woman is davening right there. And also maximizing a woman's opportunity to see the Torah and be close to it. That's obviously connected to shul architecture. It's connected to shul policy about do they bring the Torah to the women's side or close to the women's side, and every shul does that differently, and we're not going to get into that topic right now. I think also, and this connects to the Torah piece, is how the mechitza is constructed, right? How transparent, how high, how low, how the shul is structured. I've davened in shuls where the mechitza is down the middle, or as you said, there's the balcony, and there's all different ways that women in the back, there's all different ways that this can be structured. And I think that a piece of this for me that's really big is about women being involved in logistical decisions, often being involved in the building of shuls. I live in a community where all the shuls are being built. So there's women on all of those vadim. And like you said before, men sort of making sure that women feel comfortable. And I really, actually, Shanna, do want to put the piece really on the women, meaning I don't like to wait around for someone to see me. People mean well, even though it doesn't necessarily come out that way. And I really am a firm believer in women being involved in these communities and being present. And I mean, I have so many examples.
Take your seat at the table, take your seat at
exactly. Take your seat at the table. And it can be frustrating. I promise, and I have so many stories. I'm holding them back, but I think that I really want women to just place themselves. We don't need to wait for someone else to decide that we should have a place in this. Like, no, we have a place in it. I think announcing special occasions and announcing special occasions for women. I know in my shul they announced announcing bat mitzvahs and last week they sang between aliyot because a girl became a chayelet, right? She started her next stage, and so also just like women their presence is felt and celebrating their achievements.
Also, a piece
milestones.
of announcing special occasions, which was something that they did in my shul growing up, which is that when a man is called up for an aliyah, and it could be for a bar mitzvah, it could be for an ufraf, it could be whatever. So sometimes the shul will start singing, right? He'll get his aliyah, and then everyone will start singing, and then all the women are like, "Oh, what happened? Who? Whatever."
Right.
So in my shul growing up, after he would get his aliyah, they would say, "We'd like to wish a mazal tov to, the Goldberg family on the occasion of Shmuel's bar mitzvah, whatever, or we'd like to wish a mazel tov to so-and-so on the birth of their new granddaughter." And then everyone would sing. And this is something that my sister, who lives here in Alon Shvut with me, when she was the Gabai, because in Alon Shvut they also have a woman or two Gabai that are also part of like just the committee in the shul or whatever, she brought it to Alon Shvut.
They're at the Torah reading, but they're representing the community and helping.
Yeah, they're representing, they're part of the, meaning, they're not the Gabai that stands on the bima. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. But they're part of the group of Gabayim that are making sure that everything's functioning in the shul. So when she was a Gabayit, she said, "Let's bring this here." And it is something so appreciated. It really does help bring the community together. It's not like the men
You're not scrounging to figure out who had a baby.
Exactly. It's not like the men are in the know and the women are like, what's going on the other side of the mechitza. So it's a very small thing that goes a long way.
Yeah, totally. Another piece that's also significant is, let's say a woman wants to share a name to be davened for refuah shlema, if we're talking about a shul that reads all the names out loud. In the Mishaberach. So a way for her to be able to give in that name, or facilitating Birkat HaGomel for a woman to be able to say that in a comfortable way in shul. And also making sure that the Shaliach Tzibor has an audible voice, right? Or the Baal Koreh has an audible voice. It's a huge one, okay? It has an audible voice. And that's also really, really significant. And I think another last one that I'll mention here is, as I said before, the topic of women's Kaddish. It's a policy issue. And I think that a shul just needs to have a good conversation about the policy and make the policy clear. So like, I know there's a shul in my neighborhood that they have a sign actually on the door, which is not lovely. And there were women who made sure that there would be that sign there because they wanted it to just be clear so that a woman knows, right? So in that shul, the policy is that a woman can't say Kaddish alone, but there has to be another man saying it with her, which is their nice way of saying, make sure someone knows you have to say Kaddish. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's their policy, which is fine. That's their policy they decided. And they have it also clear. Yeah, so that's another piece that's really important.
You're not left guessing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I remember some of these issues really came to a head and were particularly pronounced in the COVID pandemic, right? Because there were communities that were quick to close off shuls to women in order to maximize the number of male attendees when there were very strict, numbers of people that were allowed to come to shul, whereas there were other shuls that made a very conscious decision that like, no, we're not doing that because we don't want women to feel, we don't know how long this is going to last. And even if it's only a month, we don't want women to feel that their presence doesn't matter at all. So all of the measures that you mentioned, I think certainly merit consideration. Which ones could be practically implemented and how obviously is going to depend on the nature of the community and the sensitivities of that community and the resources at their disposal and what's appropriate for them. If I could add one more thing to this great list is that similar to what you said about women like being involved and taking a seat and speaking up, just also women's leadership, whether it's in a more formal way, like a very active rebbitzin, or hiring a Kotvot Halacha, or having female members on the shul board, or whether it's like the more informal things, like women being part of the rotation of the Parsha Shir, if there's a weekly Parsha Shir, or of women, being involved in different ways in the just lay leadership of the shul, or different committees, as you mentioned. All of that makes a difference to how comfortable women feel in shul, and to whether or not they feel like this is their place too when they enter the building. Even I was recently in my brother-in-law's shul in Boca Raton, and they have in BRS, in the Boca Raton synagogue, greeters. It's very sweet. It's like they have both in the men's section and in the women's section people who are appointed to greet everyone who's coming through the door. So you come in as a woman, and maybe there's not so many women yet in the women's section, but someone says hello and Shabbat Shalom, and you know that they were put there in order to see you and to recognize your presence. That's also just these little things that I think make a difference. And also I'll just add that there are definitely women who just feel uncomfortable coming to shul during the week because they just don't like being there alone, meaning they don't want to be that woman that's the only woman in the women's section. So I don't know if it's practical. It may not be, but maybe if in a community, women could take it upon themselves to ensure that there's at least one woman who attends every, tefillah, so that if a woman, especially shacharit, so that if a woman does show up because she needs to say Kaddish, or she needs to say Hagomel, or she's coming to name, for the baby naming, or whatever it is, that she's not going to be on her own. And as I said, I did go to shul this morning after not being there for a long time. And I walked in and I was pleasantly surprised that there were two other women who were already there. And one was saying Kaddish, and one was just there because she likes to go. And then in the middle, even another woman. So we ended up being a group of 4. And I thought that was really meaningful, that I wasn't just alone there. Like, it wasn't like, okay, this, random person showed up. It was actually, no, this is a shul where if women want to, they could come to tefillah, and it's like normal. It's not completely like what's going on here.
I know that I also have the sensitivity because I said Kaddish, although I really would like to think that I would have had it even without it. But whenever a woman is saying Kaddish, I always also respond to her pacing, because often there's a gap between the pacing, and that also frustrates me. And so I look at her and I respond to her Kaddish, like ze chashuv li. It's like a personal thing. And look, I think that another thing that also can be challenging is the question about who is leading the tefillah. That also is something that the shliach tzibor is always the shliach tzibor and not the shlichat tzibor. And I think that also sometimes contributes to this feeling that we are spectators a little bit.
Yeah, and even though we mentioned earlier that like the role of the prayer leader is not necessarily the central part of what's going on, it's still a tough aspect of the communal tefillah experience for many women. And I think it's something that, if there are men listening to this episode, or men in general, should be aware of.
There
this
are.
challenge.
They write me, Shana.
Yes,
there are men. They're
we
very
know
special.
That there's men listening. Because these conversations are not only about women.
We really hope
the
they're not only
point.
for women, but the title of our podcast can be a little bit.
But we've heard from men that just, even men who are very sensitive and very aware of these things, hearing women talk about this sometimes raises issues that they didn't necessarily think about. And when it comes to this aspect, I think for me, there's 2 parts of the challenge. One is just the desire to feel connected and to feel involved and to feel agency and to feel like I'm active. I'm an active person. I don't like to sit back and like be on my couch. So like I want to be active also in shul, and that can mean I want to choose the tunes, or I want to, have an opportunity to represent the community. Now, I know that the response is often, but not every man who comes to shul is going to lead the tefillah, or not every man gets an aliyah every Shabbos morning, or not every man is going to open the aron, or not every man, is like actively engaged. And it's really hard when someone like tells me that and then says something so like, why are you making it about you? Or why are you like so self-centered or whatever? Because it's like, one second, when a man wants to step up to lean, or he wants to step up because he thinks that he could lead a meaningful musaf on Rosh Hashanah morning, we think that that's wonderful. We encourage that. Yeah. We smile upon that. So at least acknowledge, I could understand if that's not something that I could be involved in, but I don't want to feel bad for wanting or wishing that I could have those opportunities. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is that sometimes in shuls, roles are given to little kids, like to little boys, or to individuals who have special needs, which I think is really beautiful, to involve and engage kids and special needs individuals in the tefillah. But for women, it could be very isolating. I remember once that during Corona, when we were davening on the street, and it was like very complicated because, who gets aliyot, and you can't have family members. I don't know, all these halachot that I'm not really on top of. But like one time they even gave an aliyah to a kid that was not bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
Which and another time, and another time they gave an aliyah to a young man with special needs. And I remember my whole family, my kids and my husband, they come home and they're like, wow, wasn't that beautiful? Wasn't that meaningful? And I'm like, yes, it was beautiful and it was meaningful, but it wasn't a simple experience for me, I said to them. Like, to stand there and be part of this minyan the whole time, in Corona, and it was a small, intimate minyan, and they're like looking for people to give. And then it's like, yeah, it's just not a simple thing. And especially when you have like, little kids leading Kabbalat Shabbat or Psukei Dezimra, things like that. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I'm saying maybe we need to think a little bit more about this. It should be a conversation. Okay,
I'll just say maybe something a little bit sharper than that, because I, first of all, do not have a massive desire to like lead things all the time. And actually that would make, like, even if I were a complimentary man of myself, it would make me very nervous. Like that would be very stressful for me. And I hear about the stresses from my husband, who's often a chazan. Like it would make me stressed out. So I just do want to say that as someone who does love to sing, and I have a melodious voice, that when they put up a little boy there on Friday night, which also Kabbalat Shabbat, for maybe it doesn't have the halachic status, but it's a really, really lovely tefillah. Yeah. And when someone botches it, whether they're 50 or they're 10, it's really painful for me. But there's a double pain when it's a little boy who's not even bar mitzvahed, and that's who's leading the kihila. And this, by the way, is not a male-female issue. This bothers my husband deeply. Shuls who don't take their tefillah seriously enough, meaning there's a time, I really believe it's time to let kids practice. Exactly. It's time to let kids practice, and there are tefillot that should be taken seriously. And therefore, again, these are interesting differences, Israel, America,
like
different communities.
Don't sacrifice the community.
Yeah, you're sacrificing the community. And by the way, it's also uncomfortable for me as a woman that happened, because like that's just a double whammy in my heart, honestly.
I think it's really important to step back and look at the big picture, and like to know and to be aware of what's going on around you. So sometimes even when things are totally halachically fine, like it is totally halachically fine for a boy under bar mitzvah to lead Kabbalat Shabbat or to lead Psukei Dezimra, but sometimes it may just not be the right thing, definitely in certain contexts. And I know that like when we as a family spend Shabbat in Migdal Oz, and let's say even it comes time to bench, and there's many, many young, educated, intelligent, young women in the room, and they could make their own zimun, but then there happen to be more than 3 men, because it's including like my young teenage sons, and they're going to do a male zimun. So first of all, my husband's always like, maybe they should do their own zimun. But if they're like, no, okay, they don't want to do that, they just want to, a regular zimun led by the men. And he's like, well, our 13-year-old is not leading it, so like, meaning it wouldn't be right for him to lead it, even though halachically it's not an issue at all.
120 other, adult women here.
So we're not going to have a kid. So at least in that case, we'll have an adult man. But just an example of like all different kinds of situations where it's important to widen the lens and just think about how that's going to be experienced.
Look, I think it's also really important, Shana, to acknowledge in this conversation that some communities have responded to all these issues by allowing women to do a whole host of things in shuls, right? Allowing them to be chazaniot, or enabling them to be chazaniot for elements of the tefillah. I'm talking now about congregations that define themselves as Orthodox. That's important for me to say right now. Right. That they, for all the things that are not Dvarim Shebekdusha, whether it's Kabbalat Shabbat or different elements of the tefillah in the morning on Shabbat, that they do have women lead those pieces for the community. And I think that that's an important piece to put out there. And also elements of the tefillah that are less formal, like saying the tefillah l'Shem Medina, or sometimes even kiddush, right? They're all different elements of the shul process that sometimes in some communities they have become sort of flexible about figuring out how to involve women in them. And while these are controversial issues and there are questions about partnership minions or all different questions out there, I think that it is important to acknowledge here because we're voicing frustrations, and some of the solutions for the frustrations were to say, let's change the way that it's done within the realm of the halachic discourse. And anyone who's more interested in these topics can also really see the excellent articles on the website, which provide a lot, I think, of important halachic information about these topics, even if someone isn't going to engage, but it also just gives you tools to understand how they may be coming to those conclusions.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and I really, personally understand the different sides. And I feel that I have real respect for women who are looking for meaning and who are looking for connection in communal tefillah, and they don't want to be angry, and they don't want to say, that's it, I'm opting out and I'm staying at home. And they're committed to halacha.
Yeah.
And they're looking to make halachic decisions and to only do things that they think have halachic backing. I respect that. So with a lot of these issues, it may be that I may not choose that, or I may not feel that that's the right thing for me, or maybe I don't feel comfortable with it. But I think part of what someone could get from reading the articles on the site that connect to Partnership Minyanim and this is just understanding the different decisions that people make, and also what are the halachic lines, like what is okay and what's not okay, and also why there are many people that are not comfortable with it. And, obviously there's many communities where options like this don't exist, or they're considered asur or beyond the pale. And we have a lot of different kinds of listeners and a lot of people who turn to different kinds of poskim, and it really is a very, very, very complex issue. And I think just to read up on it from the inside and to understand a little bit more is something that's beneficial. For me, though, I still, keep coming back to what remains underlying to all of these conversations is, at the very least, a need for our communities to convey to a woman who chooses to join Tefillah B'tzibur that her presence matters, and that halachically she's part of the prayer community, even if she's not formally counted, and that we want her to be there. And I think part of why it's so important for as a community us to engage with this is that we see that women are looking for a communal experience of Avodat Hashem. We see it in the popularity of women gathering to divide up Tehillim, and finish Tehillim together, or to participate in main groups, or in these huge challah bakes that are going on now, where everyone does Hafreshat Challah together. We see that women want to be part of something bigger than themselves, and I would love to also see that passion in the shul context. And I think that when women are present in shul, it enhances everybody's tefillah. The idea that a community comes together, and it's not just the men, but it's the men, the women, and the children, and that you could hear everybody's voices, kind of intertwined together. I think all of that is something that benefits us as a whole, and that the same way we make efforts in many of our shuls for kids to feel comfortable there and to feel like shul is a place that they want to be, we want it to be the same experience for women.
Shana, I wanted to just bring up one more, I think, prism that I think is really important to look at, to look through this idea. And I want to bring it through an article that was really impactful on me when I read it. I think I read it 2 years ago for the first time. And it was in a book called Kotvot Halacha, which is sort of a collection of halachic articles, all written by women. They were all written by women who were trained in their halachic writing by Rabbanit Michal Tikochinsky, who is a halachic authority, I would say, here in Israel, and recognized as such. And in this book, so she has an article where she writes very passionately about the fact that our mitzvot are performed in all different contexts in our lives. Mm-hmm. One of them, she comes up with 6 categories. One of those contexts is within a minyan. But it's only one format or one structure in which we perform or dispense of our obligation, right? Well, we say Dvarim Shebekdusha, those elements of tefillah that we only say when there are 10 men present. But I just to understand her category, she talks about the fact that obviously most of our mitzvot are fulfilled by individuals, right? Whether it's lulav or tzedakah. And then another category are mitzvot that are fulfilled by individuals who make up a tzibur. And there, the best example would be Korban Pesach, which we obviously don't perform today, but the mitzvah itself is to eat the Korban Pesach within a chavura, within a group of people who are made up by those individuals. And then we have the mitzvot fulfilled by the minyan, which, as we said, is the Eidah, is this group of 10 free men. And then another category is that theoretically the mitzvahs were formed by 10 men, but there really is a preference for there being a whole tzibur, which a little bit is almost like what we almost suggested regarding elements of tefillah, meaning Dvarim Shebekdusha, you say with 10 men, but there is tremendous benefit to the whole tzibur being there, i.e. all of the women who are joining and are part of the tzibur, and of course all of the other men who are joining. Another category of mitzvot are those that are fulfilled by 10 people, but not necessarily men. And this is, the example is Megillah reading, or possibly even Birkat HaGomel. And the last one is a mitzvah fulfilled by the entirety of the tzibur, and you need the whole tzibur, right? You might say like Mitzvat Hakel, of reading with the whole tzibur, reading the pieces of the Torah. Now, I bring this article, and again, you could check it out. I'm going to link it in the show notes. But I bring this article to show you that while we attribute so much importance to minyan, it's actually the minority, as I said, of the structure and where our mitzvot are performed. And I think that it's just important, again, like gaining a little bit of perspective on, right? And as a community, we put so much emphasis on the minyan, and I feel a lot of times women discount themselves in the significance they have as being present in their mitzvah observance and the mitzvah observance of people around them. And I think that, it kind of reminds me a little bit of what happens with mitzvot aseh shazman grima, right? With time-bound mitzvot. It gets like such press,
Right.
And it's a fairly small amount of mitzvot in the whole that women are exempt from, but because they're very significant mitzvot in the way our community life has developed, like Talmud Torah, right, and different elements and Shema, and so because it's very significant, it gets. I think there's a bit of a disproportionality that develops.
And so too here. Like
and
shul
so
is very
here.
significant.
Exactly.
Significant. It gets a lot of prominence, but you're saying we shouldn't discount or let it distract us from all the other mitzvot that women are actively part of.
Totally. And I want to, though, take it a step further when it comes to tefillah, because I really want to encourage women to think of themselves as a community and not just a collection of individuals, because this deeply alters the experience of tefillah. And what do I mean here? I think that, first of all, there's such a big tradition. There's such a long-standing tradition of women davening together in a group of just women I'm speaking about, okay? That women's prayer was distinct from the male tzibur. And we know this in the shuls in medieval Europe and in medieval Ashkenaz, that they didn't have a women's section, but they actually had an independent building and a section where women would go and daven, and they would go there on Shabbat morning. So, and they had chazaniyot. I mean, we know this.
They had a space for women.
They had a space for women. They had chazaniyot, and they didn't have Torah reading. It wasn't. I'm not talking about sort of modern iterations, as I'll mention in a second. But they were there, and they were davening and having their female community of women that were there. That were not including the Dvarim Shebekdusha. And in practice, this continues today, right? In Israel, all religious education is separate, male and female. So girls are davening their entire lives until they're 18 in groups of women, right? And true in many high schools all over the world, and in all different also, swaths of the religious world, women get together all the time in tefillah. But I think that it's very different, a tefillah that is based on the idea that we together are a group of women davening together versus a bunch of women who got up and are sitting here in the same row. And the Shekhinah is there, right? Right? I promise you, the Shekhinah is there. So I think that's such an important piece. Where this question about women gathering together sometimes gets more, I would say, controversial is what's often called women's tefillah groups. And what happens in women's tefillah groups is that they're women who also read it from the Torah. It's all women, but they're often including an element of Torah reading, maybe and or aliyot. I just want to clarify that that's not what I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about the context in which women are already gathering, even before they'll get to a Beit Midrash like Migdalos, which is bichlal, right, an amazing setting for these kind of ideas, but where they're already saying Hallel together and they're already davening, and to think of themselves as a group of women, as a collective, and to try and attribute that kind of, I would say, weight and also meaning to their tefillah, and figuring out how to make it that kind of meaningful collective experience, I think is really, really significant and can be really meaningful for women.
Yeah, which is different, as you said, and apart from women's tefillah groups, which there is what to say about, and also in the articles that are linked, there's, anyone who's interested, there's a lot to read up on that. But you're talking about the context where just a lot of women gather together, not as an alternative to shul, not as like, okay, there's shul going on right now, and instead we're having our own group, but as something separate and apart. And I'll just say on a personal level, I have found those experiences to be so deeply meaningful and moving. I think one that really stood out like, and really continues to stand out to me is that in the summer of 2014, like June 2014, when the 3 boys were kidnapped and everyone was like just, choser onim, at a lack of like, what could we do, or what, like, just didn't know what to do with themselves. Migdalos organized for the women of Gush Etzion or whoever wanted to join this massive tefillah, and it included just like Tehillim and singing, and it was so huge, that idea of like women coming together, Rachel mevaka baneha, things that are very, very, very traditional, but kind of a different iteration of them, really made a big impact, I think, on everyone that was there. And also I'll share that I remember this moment in Migdalos, where I was there on a Friday night, and there was like, the hundreds of students, and the sun was setting, and we know Migdalos at the left side of the Beit Midrash, like there's always a beautiful sunset. The sun is setting. It's beautiful singing. They do Kabbalat Shabbat just with the women, and my daughter, who was like maybe 8 or something at the time, is sitting next to me singing along, and I was like, wow, the fact that she is growing up with this in her life, and she thinks it's just like normal to be part of a tefillah experience of a group of women who can daven together and stand before Hashem together and experience that feeling of like connection and community. So empowering. It makes you feel like an insider in your avodat Hashem. And I think that's what we want. We want women. We want our girls. We want our daughters. We want our students to feel like they are insiders in avodat Hashem. So even though that's not necessarily going to be the weekly experience or the daily experience, to look for opportunities where we can have those moments of women gathering in tefillah is something that's very special. Okay, this was a long episode. There's a lot to talk about. We hope people are still with us. But what's your takeaway, Yosefa?
My takeaway is that, first of all, this is a tough topic for me, honestly. It's not one that's fully baked yet. I think that different life moments, I've had different elements that sort of ring differently, that I've felt more sensitive about or less sensitive about. And I haven't totally found my comfortable footing in it. And I'll be honest, I think part of that is because I haven't totally found a shul davening experience on Shabbat that I feel fully aligned with, and that's an issue. And some of the issues reside on some of the things we're speaking about today, and some of them are not that, and they're just general, essential questions about where do I feel like there's a real tefillah going on. So that's it's still complicated for me. But I think a takeaway that I also want to remember is that there are so many ways to incorporate women into the shul community, and that I really, really encourage women to get involved in their shul as much as it can be done, and to set the tone, meaning to help set the tone, to partner with the other members of the community to make the shul experience something that feels welcoming. I'll just mention a tiny, tiny thing, actually more of what we call in Hebrew like a sort of an independent pirate project, which is that most of my energies in my community is put into, I mentioned once before in a previous episode, into this Talmud Torah, which is also a little bit more of a neutral situation. And it's just getting kids to learn Torah in the afternoon and like be excited about Avodat Hashem. And we're starting, Bezrat Hashem, I'm picking them up today, giving out these little laminated cards to the girls. It's specifically for the girls. That's where I'm sort of more of my involvement. And it's a punch card. And for 3rd and 4th graders, if you listen to 3 aliyot for Kriyat Torah, which means you're there for Kriyat Torah, then you get a punch on your card. And for 5th and 6th grade girls, it's being there for all of Torah reading. And if you're there for, let's say, 80%.
Can my daughter join?
Yes, she can. Wait, I'll tell you in a second, though. I'm going to mention that. But if you get sort of 80%, so if you're part of the Talmud Torah and you come to our Mishnah Shiurim on Sunday, then the teacher punches your card. And after, when the Sefer is done and you were at most of the readings, and you get a really nice little gift certificate to a craft store in our neighborhood. But exactly what you just said, can your daughter join, is that I wrote it on the general women's list in the neighborhood. And I printed them. And I said, anybody who wants this, I can't have the Mishnah teacher punch your card, and I'm not going to give them their, the craft store certificate, but in their home, they could do it in their own home. Like, I want this to be for anybody. Please. Not only the kids who come on Sunday. And one of the women who I work with said like, oh, that was so sweet of you to do that. I'm like, this is really lishma. Like, I really just want I want families to care about the fact that their kids are going to come to shul. And in Israel, I would say it's really, really, really common. In the Dati Leumi world, you have a lot of Friday night attendance, and Shabbat morning can often be more dwindly. So that's also part of the effort to try and have an incentive to get them to come. I love those experiences of davening in really powerful groups of women who get together and serve Hashem together. But ultimately, this conversation is really to try and think about how we can make the shul experience in the traditional sense that there are men and women there together, how we can make this a meaningful experience that sees all the members of the community. And I think that there are a lot of creative ways that we can go about figuring out how to do that.
Absolutely. I am definitely taking one of those cards from you because, thank God, my daughter has really started coming to shul for shacharit. It's hard to get her to stay for the entire thing because there's not so many other young girls in shul her age. So I'm all in on that one. I come away from this conversation, even in my prep, I was feeling this, just feeling re-inspired to try to get back to davening with the minyan, maybe not every day and maybe not always, and maybe not with a sense of like guilt or pressure, but from a sense of like, I actually really believe in this. I really believe in Tefillah B'tzibor. And I know, and I was reminded again this morning, that my personal silent Shemona Esrei is often better when I daven it along with other people. And I feel like you do, that the more women are in shul, the more shuls are going to accommodate women, and the more shuls will be friendlier places. And the more other women will feel comfortable coming if they know that there's women that they could count on to be there. And I want to actively try to do my part to make that happen. So thank you. Every episode, like my husband's like, so what are you adding now? Maybe it's going to be too much, but no, on a personal level, it's been really meaningful for me to like engage in these topics. So thank you.
Thank you, Shayna. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance with all of them. You can contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. That's womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.